Let's take a step into the world of studies. Timothy Leary, who was he, and what were the most important ideas you've learned from him?
Well, I did have the opportunity to get to know him personally and to spend some time with him. Timothy Leary, well, let's start with Nixon saying he's the most dangerous man in America.
That's a good place to start. Yes.
Yeah. And why did Nixon say that? It's because of this tune in, turn on, tune in, drop out. Timothy Leary was just an incredible advocate for think for yourself, question authority. Those were things he said all the time. Think for yourself, question authority. He was a rebel. He was kicked out of West Point. He was a psychologist who was at Harvard for 3 years, from 60 to 63. Before he got to Harvard, he had an experience with mushrooms in Mexico. And that, he said, he learned more in that experience than he'd had in his entire academic career before then about how the human mind works. And so he came to Harvard wanting to do research into psychedelics. And he did some very important studies, both of which, one was called the Good Friday experiment, which was whether psychedelics in religiously inclined people taking psilocybin in a religious setting, whether it could produce a mystical experience. That took place at Marsh Chapel at the Boston University. Because it's a little bit subjective, or you could say entirely subjective, what people describe happens to them, he wanted to do another study, which would be a more objective measure, and that was called the Concord Prison Experiment. And that was the thought: if you can give people psilocybin, mystical sense of connection type experiences while they're in prison, when they get out, they'll be more pro-social and they'll have reduced recidivism. So Tim did that. He also did naturalistic studies of giving loads of people psilocybin and sort of writing down what their experiences were, the range of experiences. Later on, in his time at Harvard, they started doing LSD, and LSD is more cerebral, longer lasting, not as reassuring in a way as psilocybin. Sometimes he used to say that if they never got into LSD, they'd still be at psychedelic with the psilocybin. So he was a great American psychologist, but then he got tired of the psychology game, you could say, or he would say that. He got more and more interested in cultural change, and various musicians and artists and all sorts of people started coming to him for the psychedelic experience that they are, in a way, for creativity, for other things. So he started hanging out with all sorts of famous people, or creative people, and he stopped going to classes a lot. And Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, had given LSD to a student that Ram Dass was courageous enough to admit that he had sexual interest in. They weren't supposed to give it undergraduates. That was about the only time that they ever did it. And psychedelics just getting more and more controversial, even in the early 60s. Eventually he got kicked out of Harvard, and then he became kind of a cultural icon for the counterculture, and was hounded by the police and Nixon, and spent a lot of time in jail. I mean, he's an incredible person. One thing that Ram Dass said is that Richard Albert Ram Dass said, "I'm a rascal, but Leary's a scoundrel."
What's the distinction?
Rascal's like in good fun. A scoundrel is like you can't quite trust them, I think. I think that
it's a spectrum of sorts.
Yeah, I think that Leary was someone who a little bit got addicted to media attention. And, but I think that overall, he gets blamed a lot for the backlash against the 60s, the shutdown of psychedelic research. I think that he is unfairly blamed for a lot of that. I think when you look back at the 60s, the common narrative is that it was because psychedelics going wrong. People took psychedelics, they weren't prepared, they had emotional breakdowns, they went psychotic, they killed themselves, they did this or that, different problems of people taking psychedelics in contexts that they didn't feel fairly safe in, or just they weren't prepared, or they didn't know how much they were taking, or all this. So the backlash was because psychedelics gone wrong. But I think the real reason, while that did happen, I think the real reason is psychedelics going right, and people having this sense of connection, and then the opposite of what the CIA was hoping, that it would kind of turn people inward and take them away from political struggles. It actually motivated people. Once you actually have these psychedelic experiences, your attitude towards death changes also. This idea of death becoming an intrinsic part of life. It's a natural cycle. It's not so much. So I think people realize that, while there's this billions of years of evolution, infinity, whatever that means in terms of time, that we're here for a very limited time, and they end up wanting to use their time well. They have a lessened fear of death, and they want to build this paradise on earth here, now, instead of later. Mm-hmm. So a lot of people really did get motivated to challenge the Vietnam War, to work on the environmental movement, civil rights movement, women's rights movement, anti-militarism. And it was that challenge to the status quo that caused the backlash. So Leary is someone who, in 1990, we had now MAPS I started in 86. So in 1990, we had this conference to raise money out in California, and Leary was there, and Ram Dass was there, and Ralph Metzner was there, and Andy Weil was there, and Terrence McKenna was there, and Dennis McKenna was there, and all these. But there was one point where Tim was speaking, and afterwards I was asking him some questions. And I said, do you have any advice for us on how to work with the government and how to bring these psychedelics forward? That's what we're trying to do. I've got this nonprofit for it. We're trying to do this research. What is your advice on how to bring this forward and how to work with the government? Mm-hmm. And he said, fuck the government. He said, I am so far past asking for permission for anything, but I'm glad that you're doing it. And then he held up my hand like passing the torch.
Wow.
So it was, and that's one of my favorite photographs of me and Tim, where he's sort of like, but it was after this, fuck the government. I'm so far past asking for permission for anything, but I'm glad that you are.